She had two choices: die on his terms or disappear on hers. For 3 years, Alara Voss had survived inside a mansion that looked like wealth and felt like a grave. Her husband smiled at church on Sundays and broke her ribs on Mondays. The whole town of Red Hollow, Montana knew. The sheriff knew. The judge knew. The preacher knew. And every single one of them looked the other way, because Darius Kane owned everything: the land, the law, and the silence of every coward who cashed his checks. But one frozen January morning, a stranger walked into a general store and changed everything. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you stay until the end, you'll understand why the most dangerous thing Alara ever did wasn't picking up a gun. It was deciding she was worth saving. The general store on Caldwell Street smelled like pine resin, dried tobacco, and the particular kind of cold that seeps through wooden walls, no matter how many logs you throw on the fire. January in Red Hollow, Montana was not the kind of winter that invited poetry. It was the kind of winter that killed livestock, cracked axle wheels, and reminded every man, woman, and child in the valley that the frontier didn't care about them personally. Alara Voss. She still thought of herself as Voss, even after 3 years of being legally, officially, and inescapably Alara Kane, stood in front of a shelf of dry goods with a list in her left hand and a bruise along her jaw that she'd powdered over that morning with the same mechanical focus she brought to every humiliation. It had faded to yellow at the edges. That meant it was almost a week old. That meant she was almost due for another one. She was 25 years old, and she moved like a woman twice that age. The list was written in Vivian Crow's handwriting, Darius's aunt, who ran the Kane household with the particular cruelty of someone who had once been powerless herself and never forgave the world for it. Flour, salt pork, lamp oil, 2 spools of black thread. The list was practical, domestic, and completely beside the point of why Alara had been brought to town. The real reason she was here was so Darius could keep an eye on her. The Kane mansion sat 7 miles outside Red Hollow, and whenever Darius felt her getting too quiet, too withdrawn, too much like a person thinking her own thoughts, he brought her to town, let her feel the walls close in from all directions instead of just 4. She reached for the flour. "That's 22 pounds, said old Harlan Betts from behind the counter. He was 60-something, gone soft around the middle, with a white beard and the permanently apologetic eyes of a man who had spent 30 years watching things he wished he hadn't. "Heavy for a lady to carry." "I'll manage," Alara said. She always managed. That was the problem. The door behind her opened with a gust of frozen air, and without turning around, she felt the temperature in the room change in a different way. The way it changes when someone large enters a small space, and everyone in that space becomes suddenly, quietly aware of it. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the shelf and moved to the salt pork. Alara. Darius Kane's voice had a particular quality she'd spent 3 years studying the way a person studies a storm. Not because they wanted to, but because their survival depended on reading every shift in the air pressure, every change in the light. Right now, his voice was what she privately called the public voice. Controlled. Almost warm. The voice he used when he wanted other people nearby to think he was a reasonable man. She turned. I was standing in the doorway still, snow on his shoulders, his hat pulled low. Darius Kane was 41 years old, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man accustomed to getting everything he wanted. Broad through the chest, well-dressed for a frontier cattle town, with a jaw like carved limestone, and eyes the gray-green of shallow river water. Not ugly. That was one of the things about him that had fooled her father, fooled the whole town. Maybe fooled Alara herself, once, very briefly, before she understood what lived behind those river water eyes. "You forgot the lamp oil," he said, gesturing at her list. "It's on the list." "Then why are you standing by the salt pork?" She said nothing. This was also a learned behavior. Silence as armor, as strategy. Saying the wrong thing added time. Saying the wrong thing in front of people was worse, because then she had to survive the ride home too. Harlan Betts found something urgent to do in the back room. The 2 women who'd been browsing fabric near the window both became very interested in a bolt of brown cotton. The only other person in the store, a young ranch hand she didn't recognize, glanced up once and then looked hard at the floor. Darius crossed the room in 4 strides. He took the list from her hand, not violently, almost gently, which was sometimes worse, and looked at it the way a schoolmaster looks at a failing student's examination. "Vivian wrote lamp oil at the bottom," he said. You started in the middle. I was working through it. Were you? It wasn't a question. His eyes moved over her face, cataloging the powdered bruise, the way she was holding herself. Slightly turned, her left side angled away from him. Old habit, protect the ribs. She watched him decide something. You moved the money, he said, lower now. Still controlled, still public, but with something else underneath. Alara's stomach dropped 3 inches. I don't know what you mean. There were $40 in the desk drawer in my study. There are 38 now. $2. She had taken $2 out of a drawer that held 40 and hidden them in the lining of her winter coat because she had been slowly, carefully, terrifyingly saving money for longer than she wanted to admit. Nickels and dimes and the occasional dollar, accumulated over 18 months with the patience of someone who had no other options. She had a total of $11.60 hidden in 3 different places throughout the house. 2 of them were in her coat right now. I bought thread, she said. Last week. I told you. Thread is on Vivian's list. Vivian handles thread. There wasn't enough of the right color in the house. I used my own money. You don't have your own money. The women by the fabric had gone completely still. Darius reached out and took her by the upper arm. His grip was careful and precise, firm enough to communicate exactly what it meant, not hard enough to leave a mark visible above her sleeve. He'd had years of practice at that particular calibration. We'll discuss this at home, he said. Darius, I said we'll discuss it at home. He began moving her toward the door and she went, because she had learned that going was always better than not going, at least in public. At least when it was still the public voice and not the other one. They were 3 steps from the door when a voice said, let go of her arm. Everyone in the general store of Caldwell Street, Red Hollow, Montana turned to look at the man who had just said the most dangerous 4 words in the county. I was standing beside the counter near the door. She hadn't even registered him coming in, which meant he'd entered sometime after Darius and moved quietly for a man of his size. He was tall, not in the exaggerated way of men who made a performance of their height, but in the plain functional way of someone built for hard work in hard country. Heavy coat, dark fur, worn leather, boots that had seen 1,000 miles of mountain trail. A face that was weather-darkened and sharp-boned, somewhere in his middle 30s, with dark eyes that were doing something unusual for this county. They were looking directly at Darius Kane without any of the careful diplomatic blankness that everyone else in Red Hollow had spent years perfecting. I was looking at Darius the way you look at a man you've already decided something about. Darius stopped. He didn't release her arm. He turned his head slowly toward the stranger with the expression of a man who has just heard an unfamiliar sound and is trying to determine whether it's worth his attention. Excuse me, Darius said. Heard me fine. The stranger hadn't moved. His hands were loose at his sides. Let go of her arm. The young ranch hand near the back wall pressed himself very flat against the shelves. Harlan Betts had reappeared in the doorway to the back room and was watching with an expression somewhere between horror and something that might, in different light, have been mistaken for hope. Darius Kane laughed. It was a short, flat sound, the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to express amusement. Son, he said, do you have any idea who I am? Yep, said the stranger. A pause. Then you know, Darius said, his voice lowering in a way that Alara had learned to dread, that you just made a very serious mistake. Could be. The stranger still hadn't moved, but something in the quality of his stillness had shifted, the way a river looks different right before it goes over a falls. Or could be you're the one making it. Either way, you're going to let go of that woman's arm. Darius turned fully toward him now, releasing Alara's arm. Not because he'd chosen to listen, but because he needed both hands free for whatever he'd already decided to do next. He was 4 inches shorter than the stranger and 40 pounds lighter, but Darius Kane had never in his adult life met a situation he couldn't control through money, through power, or through the casual application of violence. He had 6 hired men waiting outside. He had the sheriff in his pocket. He had an entire county's worth of evidence that consequence did not apply to him. You're a trapper, Darius said, looking the man up and down with practiced contempt. Mountain man. You come down for supplies maybe twice a season. You don't own land. You don't vote. You don't bank here. You have no stake in this town, no standing in this county, and no idea what you've walked into. Sure, said the stranger. So I'm going to give you exactly 1 opportunity to walk out that door and forget this conversation happened. Appreciate that, said the stranger in a tone that did not sound appreciative. Going to pass, though. Darius moved fast. Alara had seen him move fast before. She knew how to read the specific shift of weight that preceded it. But the stranger moved faster. He caught Darius's wrist in his right hand, mid-swing, and squeezed. The sound Darius made was not something she had ever heard from him before. It was small and involuntary, a sharp compression of breath. And in the white, shocked silence of the general store of Caldwell Street, it was enormously, almost surreally loud. The stranger held him there, not twisting, not threatening further, just holding, with a grip that was apparently doing something interesting to the bones in Darius Kane's wrist. Easy, said the stranger, not to Alara, but to Darius in the same low, calm voice. Everybody walks out of here today. That's how this goes. You follow me? Darius was breathing through his nose, his face gone white around the jaw and red along the cheekbones. He didn't answer. I need to hear you say you follow me, said the stranger. Yes, said Darius, and the word came out cracked and strange in a way that Alara would think about for a long time afterward. The stranger released him. Darius stepped back. He straightened his coat. He picked up his hat, which had fallen, and settled it back on his head with the careful deliberateness of a man reconstructing himself. The gray-green eyes moved from the stranger to Alara, to the room at large, and she could see him calculating. Not retreating, never retreating, but calculating, filing, storing. Get to the horse, he said to her, quiet and flat. She went. She didn't look at the stranger again. She couldn't afford to. But as she passed through the door into the frozen January air, she heard Harlan Betts say something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Lord Almighty, the old man breathed. Did you see that? The ride back to the Kane mansion was 7 miles of absolute silence. Darius rode 3 lengths ahead of her. He didn't speak. He didn't look back. The snow on the road had been packed hard by wagon traffic, and their horses moved through it with a sound like grinding teeth, and the sky above the valley was the flat, featureless white of a sky that was deciding whether to snow again and leaning toward yes. Alara rode with her eyes on the middle distance and her mind in a very small, very controlled place. She had learned to do this, to take whatever was coming and reduce it to something she could manage by making herself smaller inside, pulling back from the edges of her own consciousness, until what was happening to a woman who was adjacent to her, but not entirely her. It was a survival trick. It was also, she understood on some level, she didn't visit very often, the kind of thing that leaves marks that don't powder over. The Kane mansion sat at the end of a road lined with bare aspens. It had been built by Darius's father, a man reputedly more brutal than his son, which was a fact Alara had always found difficult to hold in her head. It was large by frontier standards, 2 stories, 6 bedrooms, a parlor, a study, a kitchen big enough to service a working cattle operation. It looked, from the road in winter, almost elegant. Vivian Crow was waiting on the porch. Vivian was 63 years old and had the posture of a woman who had spent her entire life being right and found it exhausting. She was Darius's father's sister, unmarried, who had come to manage the household after the senior Kane's death and had never left, perhaps because there was nowhere else in the world where her particular talents were so thoroughly appreciated. She was small and angular, with white hair pulled back in a style that had been fashionable 20 years ago, and she watched Alara dismount with an expression of cold assessment that Alara had long ago stopped trying to interpret as anything other than what it was. "You're late," Vivian said. "The roads were—" "I wasn't speaking to you." Vivian's eyes were on Darius, who had handed his horse to the stable boy and was walking toward the house with the deliberate, measured tread of a man who had made a decision and was now in the process of implementing it. He said something to Vivian in a low voice as he passed her. Alara caught 2 words, trapper and tonight. Then they both went inside and the door closed, and Alara stood in the cold for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the door, calculating. The calculation was not complicated. It had the same answer it always had. She went inside. The evening began with dinner, which was conducted in the particular silence of households where everyone knows what's coming and has tacitly agreed not to mention it. Vivian served roast beef and potatoes and spoke exclusively about a neighbor's fence line dispute, a subject which interested no one but which filled the necessary silence with sound. Darius ate steadily and said nothing. Alara ate as much as she could, because she'd learned to eat when she could, and drank water and kept her eyes on her plate. After dinner, Vivian retired to her room. This was the signal. Alara sat in the kitchen on the pretense of cleaning up and listened to Darius's footsteps above her head, tracking him through the ceiling the way you track a storm through the sound of it moving. Study. Hallway. Study again. Hallway. He came downstairs. Sit down, he said. She sat. He stood across the table from her with his hands flat on the surface, and she watched his face do the thing it did. The controlled exterior softening in a specific direction, not toward warmth, but toward something that lived in the same neighborhood as grief, though it was something far uglier dressed in grief's clothing. I embarrassed you, he said. This was a pattern she knew. It came before. You embarrassed yourself, he continued. In town. In front of that man. You made me look like... You made it seem like I was... He stopped. Reorganized. Who is he? I don't know. You've never seen him before? No? But he stepped in for you, a stranger, which means either you know him or you did something to make him think he had cause. He paused. Which is it? Neither, she said. I don't know him. I've never spoken to him. He just... Men don't just do things, Alara. There's a reason for everything. There is always a reason. His voice was still quiet, still almost reasonable, and she knew the quiet was not peace. The quiet was the locked door before the room on the other side of it. So I'm going to ask you again, do you know that man? No, Darius. Did you arrange this? Did you ask someone in town to... No. He moved around the table faster than she anticipated. He was always faster than she anticipated. That was one of his skills, one of the things he understood about fear, that if you were always slightly faster than the other person expected you to be, the surprise itself did half your work for you. She caught the table's edge with her hip going down and knocked her chair sideways, and the sound of the chair hitting the flagstone floor was very loud in the quiet kitchen. You think that man helped you, he said, above her. You think that changes something. She didn't answer. It changes nothing. You understand me? The only thing that changes is that now I have to find him and explain to him very carefully what happens to people who put their hands in cane business. He crouched down to her level, which she had always found one of the most frightening things he did, because it was patient, and patience in Darius meant he had already decided there was no rush. And you are going to tell me everything you know about him, every word he said, every word you said, every... I told you. He said 2 sentences. I don't know his name. I've never seen him. He studied her face for a long time. All right, he said finally, and stood. And the terrible thing about all right in Darius Kane's vocabulary was that it never meant what the word said it meant. It meant, I believe you, but believing you doesn't change anything. What came after lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, she lay on the kitchen floor and listened to his footsteps go up the stairs, and she counted them out of old habit, 12 steps. And she looked at the ceiling and she breathed very carefully around the thing in her side that told her the rib was cracked again. She thought about this man in the general store. His voice. Let go of her arm. 4 words, flat and simple, with nothing in them that was asking permission or expecting gratitude or performing heroism. Just 4 words stating a thing that should have been obvious to everyone in the room and apparently wasn't. She thought about how Darius's face had looked when that hand closed around his wrist. That small, involuntary sound. She hadn't heard Darius Kane make an involuntary sound in 3 years. She lay on the floor for a while longer and then she got up, because the floor was cold and getting up was what you did. And she cleaned the kitchen and went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about the money in her coat lining and the money in the loose board under the wardrobe and the money in the small gap behind the kitchen chimney stones. $11.60. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. 3 years earlier, Alara Voss had been a different kind of person, not different in the ways that matter most. She'd always been stubborn, observant, impatient with pretension, capable of anger. She didn't always know what to do with. But she'd been lighter. She'd laughed more easily. She'd had a habit of arguing with people she respected, which she'd always thought was a sign of respect. She'd been good with horses, mediocre at sewing, excellent at figures, and possessed of a reading habit her mother had encouraged, and her father had thought was vaguely suspicious in a woman. Her father, Thomas Voss, had been a decent man in most of the ways that count, and a catastrophically bad businessman in the ways that ended up mattering most. He'd run a small cattle operation, 20 acres, a modest herd, and had borrowed money from Darius Kane to expand it during a good season, because Darius had made it sound like an investment rather than a debt. and because Thomas Voss believed that men who presented themselves as reasonable were reasonable, which was a failure of imagination that had cost him everything. The operation failed, the seasons turned. The debt remained, accrued, interest like a living thing grew teeth. Thomas Voss had died in October of 1882, 2 days after the first hard frost, of what the doctor called a failure of the heart, and what Alara had always privately understood as a failure of the spirit, that specific frontier collapse that happened to men who'd built their lives on the assumption that hard work was sufficient and discovered, too late, that it wasn't. He'd left behind Alara, a house with a lien against it, and a debt to Darius Kane of approximately $800. Darius had come to her with a proposal 3 weeks after the funeral. She'd been 22. She'd had no money, no land, no family left in the territory, no clear path forward, and a frontier that was not, in 1882, overflowing with options for unattached young women with $800 of inherited debt. Darius had been charming, attentive. He'd spoken about her father with what had seemed like genuine respect. He talked about the land and the house as if they would be hers again, as if marrying him was a way of reclaiming what her family had built, rather than surrendering the last thing she had. She'd said yes, and she'd been wrong, and she had spent 3 years paying for being wrong in a currency that didn't show up in any ledger. The marriage had taken approximately 4 months to reveal itself. Not all at once. That was another thing about Darius. He was patient in his cruelties. He introduced them gradually, the way you lower a frog into water, adjusting the temperature so incrementally that by the time you realize what's happening, the moment to jump has already passed. First the criticism, then the isolation, friends discouraged, visits curtailed, her movements quietly and then overtly controlled. Then Vivian, installed in the household not as a relative but as an extension of Darius himself, a second set of eyes and a primary instrument of psychological erosion. Then the first incident, which Darius had explained as temporary, exceptional, her fault, in 17 specific ways that she had not been able to immediately refute, which she had understood later, was the point. By the end of the first year, she had understood the shape of her life. By the end of the second year, she had started hiding money. It was Vivian she was most afraid of, in some ways. Darius was violent in direct, legible ways that she had learned to read and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, to mitigate. Vivian was something else. Vivian understood psychology the way a surgeon understands anatomy, not for the purpose of healing, but for the purpose of targeting. She knew which words to use to make a person doubt their own perceptions. She knew how to reframe every act of cruelty as an act of care, every act of control as an act of protection, until the person being controlled began to use the same language, began to explain their own imprisonment to themselves in the terms of their imprisoner, began to wonder if maybe, they were the problem. There had been moments, not many, but some, when Alara had caught herself thinking in Vivian's voice and had physically left the room she was in, walked outside regardless of weather, stood in the cold until the voice cleared and her own thoughts came back, a little thinner and rougher than before, but still hers. The money was her own thoughts made physical. The money was the part of herself she was keeping. $11.60. She knew it wasn't enough to get anywhere safe. She didn't have a destination. She didn't have a plan beyond out. And out was large and cold and full of dangers that were different from the ones inside the house, but arguably no less serious. And she was aware of all of this, held it in careful tension against the knowledge that staying was its own trajectory with its own terminal point. She'd been waiting. She wasn't sure what she'd been waiting for. The morning after the incident in the kitchen, she woke to find Vivian already in the kitchen, making coffee with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided that what had happened the night before was a domestic matter, that had been handled and required no further acknowledgement. Alara sat at the table and drank the coffee and looked at the grain of the wood and said nothing, and Vivian talked about the fence line dispute again, as if it were a favorite piece of music she found soothing to return to. Darius is going to Billings, Vivian said eventually. Day after tomorrow. Business. All right, said Alara. He'll be gone 4 days. I'll need you to handle the household accounts while he's away. A pause. Under my supervision. Of course. Vivian looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup with those flat, measuring eyes. You know, she said, in the tone of voice she used for the things she said that were supposed to sound like kindness and weren't, Darius worries about you. His temper. She paused, as if choosing words carefully. It comes from caring,
From fear. He's afraid of losing you. Alara looked at her coffee.
I know, she said, because it was the only answer available to her in that room on that morning in that house, and because she'd learned that the truth, that what Darius feared was not losing her but losing control of her, which was a different thing entirely, was not something she was capable of saying in Vivian Crow's kitchen without consequences. What she thought was, he's going to Billings in 2 days. What she thought, underneath that, in the part of her mind that she kept very quiet and very carefully protected, was 4 days. Darius did not go to Billings. Or rather, he went to Billings, and he came back from Billings in 2 days instead of 4, which was not what he'd told her and not what he'd told Vivian either. And the fact that Vivian looked genuinely surprised when his horse came up the road on the second evening told Alara something she filed away carefully. Whatever Darius had decided, he'd decided it alone. He called her to the study after supper. The study was Darius's room in the way that certain spaces belonged entirely to the personality that occupied them. The walls lined with ledgers and land maps, and a single painting of the Montana foothills that might have been beautiful in different company. The fireplace was burning high. He was sitting behind his desk, and he gestured to the chair across from it, and she sat. He looked different. She noticed that immediately, the way you notice a change in the sound of an engine before you understand what it means. Something had settled in him, some decision made and accepted, and the thing that had been coiled and unpredictable behind his eyes for weeks had quieted into something more purposeful, and therefore, she understood instinctively, more dangerous. I want to talk to you about your situation, he said. Her situation. Already the language of displacement. I've been thinking, he continued, folding his hands on the desk in that careful boardroom way he had, that the arrangement we have is not working. She said nothing. You're unhappy. He said it as if it were a technical observation, a finding from an inspection. And I've come to believe that Red Hollow is too small for you, too limiting. She waited. I spoke to a man in Billings, a businessman. He operates certain, Darius paused, chose, establishments across the Idaho border, mining camp country. He's always looking for women who are... He kept talking. Alara heard the words. She understood the words. But there was a strange delay between the hearing and the understanding, a few seconds of total white silence in which her mind refused to process the sentence it had just received, because the sentence was not something her mind had been prepared to receive, and then the delay ended and the sentence arrived and she understood it completely, and the room tilted. She kept her face still. She had practice at that. A clean arrangement, Darius was saying. You go. The debt is cleared. I file for dissolution of the marriage on grounds of abandonment, which is... When? She said. He stopped. When? She said again. When were you planning to, sir? Spring, he said. March. The passes will be clear enough by... You made this decision. I've been generous with you, Alara. More generous than... You made this decision, she said again, and her own voice sounded strange to her, flat and distant, coming from somewhere below the room she was sitting in, without telling me. Your input on this isn't... She stood up. Darius stood up too, automatically, the way he always did when she moved unexpectedly, the instinct of a man who had learned to control space as a primary tactic. Sit down, he said. No. The word came out of her mouth like something that had been stored under pressure. Darius stared at her. She stared back at him. The fire in the fireplace made a sound like a slow exhalation, and outside the study windows, the January dark pressed flat and complete against the glass. And somewhere in the house a clock ticked the seconds out with perfect mechanical indifference. Alara, he said, softer, which was worse. I need to check on something in the kitchen, she said. She left the study. She walked down the hallway. She walked into the kitchen and she stood at the sink and she gripped the edge of the basin with both hands and she breathed. March. She had until March. No. She corrected herself, gripping the basin harder. She did not have until March. She had whatever time it took for him to decide that waiting until March was inconvenient, and Darius Kane had never in his life waited patiently for something he'd already decided to take. She had days. Maybe less. She stood at the sink and she breathed and she thought about $11.60 and a blizzard that had been threatening for 2 weeks and 7 miles of frozen road between the Kane mansion and the town of Red Hollow, and whatever was on the other side of Red Hollow that was not this. She thought about the man in the general store. Let go of her arm. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he lived. She didn't know anything about him except that he had looked at Darius Kane without fear and spoken without asking permission, and for reasons she couldn't have fully articulated. Reasons that were less about logic than about some deep body knowledge she'd been accumulating for 3 years. She believed that mattered. She let go of the basin. She went to the loose board under the wardrobe. She went to the gap behind the kitchen chimney stones. She went to the coat. $11.60. She took the revolver from the drawer where Darius kept it, the one he left in the kitchen because the kitchen was her domain, and therefore, in his logic, beneath his notice. It was a Colt single action, .38 caliber, and she had learned to shoot it 3 years ago in a different life when her father was still alive, and shooting meant tin cans on fence posts and the warm weight of her father's hand correcting the angle of her wrist. She checked the cylinder, 5 rounds. She wrapped herself in the heavy fur coat. She checked the money in the lining. She put the revolver in the deep inside pocket where she'd always thought. In an abstract, theoretical way, she'd put a revolver if she ever needed one. She listened to the house. Darius was in the study. Vivian's room was on the far side of the upper floor. The stable boys slept above the stable, well away from the main house. She went to the back door. She opened it. The blizzard that had been threatening for 2 weeks came through the door like something alive, like something that had been waiting specifically for this moment. And the cold was immediate and physical and absolute, and she stood in the doorway for 3 seconds with the warmth of the house pushing at her back and the winter dark pulling at her front. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost hallucinatory in its completeness, that she was about to leave everything she had ever known and walk into weather that killed people and had no particular reason to spare her. She stepped through the door. She pulled it closed behind her. She walked toward the stable. She took the gray mare because the gray mare was older and quieter, and less likely to make noise about being saddled at 9 o'clock at night during a snowstorm. Her hands were shaking, not from cold yet, from something more fundamental, and the saddle took longer than it should have, 3 tries at the girth buckle before it caught, and she kept listening for the back door of the house to open and didn't hear it. The stable boy's lamp was out above her. He slept like a stone. She knew this. She'd cataloged it, the way she'd cataloged everything in that house, every habit and schedule and vulnerability. Because knowledge of your environment is the last thing taken from a person, even when everything else has been. She led the mare out into the dark and mounted and turned her toward the road. For the first half-mile, she could still see the lights of the house behind her. Then the blizzard swallowed them. After that, it was just her and the mare and the wind and the dark. And the dark was the kind that exists only in winter wilderness. Not the dark of a cloudy night in town, but the dark of a world that has genuinely removed itself, that has pulled all light and reference back to some distant administrative center, and left you with nothing but the snow that the wind was driving horizontal, and the road that she could feel more than see, and the cold that was not politely cold but aggressively, personally cold. The kind that doesn't wait for you to lower your guard, but comes straight at the gaps in your coat and your collar and your boots with the efficiency of something that knows its job. She wrote it. She thought about direction, north and east toward Red Hollow, 7 miles on a road she knew well in daylight and not very well at all in the dark during a blizzard. She thought about what was in Red Hollow, the general store, the hotel, the livery. Harlan Betts, who would not protect her, a sheriff who worked for Darius, 400 or 500 people who had all made the same calculation she had watched them make for 3 years and arrived at the same answer. Not my problem. She thought about what was beyond Red Hollow. She thought about Bitter Peak, which was the ridge of mountains above the valley's north end, which was where, according to the fragments of conversation she'd absorbed over 3 years in a town where people talked about their neighbors constantly, the mountain trappers worked their lines. There were 2 or 3 of them, men who lived up in the high country and came down for supplies in town 2 or 3 times a season, who knew the mountain passes and the river crossings, and the hidden routes through the wilderness that didn't appear on any survey map, men who had no stake in the Kane Empire. She was 3 miles from the house, she estimated, when the mare went down. Not badly. A stumble on ice under snow, the horse lurching sideways, catching herself, but the stumble threw Alara sideways, and her right boot caught the stirrup coming down, and she hit the road not cleanly but rolling, and the wind took her hat, and the snow was in her face, and by the time she'd sorted out which direction was up, and gotten her boot clear, and gotten herself vertical, she was breathing hard, and the mare was 10 feet away, standing and intact but shivering, and the cold had found every gap in Alara's coat, and was working its way inward with urgent efficiency. She caught the mare. She remounted. She kept riding. The second fall was worse. A mile further on, The road crossed a small creek that ran under the trail through a culvert in spring and summer and froze into a treacherous, invisible ice-slicked grade in winter. She hit it wrong. The mare went down hard this time, both front knees, and Alara went over her head entirely and landed in the snowbank on the creek's far side and lay there for a moment that stretched out longer than it should have, staring up at a sky that was solid moving white, thinking with some distant part of her mind, this is where it ends. The mare had gotten up and was moving away. She couldn't see her in the dark. She was alone, on the ground, in the middle of a Montana blizzard, in a fur coat with a revolver and $11.60, approximately 4 miles from the Kane Mansion and 3 miles from Red Hollow, and the cold was doing what cold does, which is to say it was beginning to feel, paradoxically, less cold, which she knew from something her father had told her once was the specific danger sign, the point where the body gives up arguing with the temperature and starts making peace with it. She got up. She walked. She didn't know how far she walked or for how long. Time did a strange thing in cold like that, either stretching or compressing. She couldn't tell which. And the road was invisible, and she was navigating by feel and instinct and a stubbornness that she'd always thought of as a character flaw and was now thinking of differently. The wind came in gusts that pushed her sideways, and she pushed back. Her feet had gone numb first, and then come back in a way that felt like walking on boards. And her hands inside her gloves were a distant concern, and her face she had mostly stopped consulting. She found a pine tree. She didn't choose it. She arrived at it the way you arrive at things in extremis, not quite aware of having traveled the intervening distance, simply finding yourself somewhere new and registering that the wind was less here, under the heavy lower branches, with the trunk at her back. She slid down it. The snow was deep. It came up around her, and she thought, in a voice that was very quiet and very tired, that she should get up, that sitting in snow was specifically one of the things you weren't supposed to do, that her father had told her that. But the voice making that point was getting quieter, and the snow was getting less cold, and the pine tree was solid and real at her back, and she was so tired of holding herself up. She closed her eyes. She heard very distantly, as if from the far end of a long corridor, a sound that was not wind. Then she heard nothing. Then she was warm, not gradually warm, simply warm, with no transition she was conscious of, and there was a ceiling above her made of rough-hewn logs, and a fire somewhere to her left that she could feel on the side of her face, and the smell of pine smoke, and something animal, fur and leather, and cold air brought inside, and the weight of blankets on her that were not her blankets, and she turned her head. A man was sitting in a chair beside the fire. He was looking at the fire, not at her. He had a tin cup in both hands. He was exactly as large as she remembered him being. She opened her mouth. "Don't try to sit up yet," he said, without looking at her. "Feet aren't ready." She looked at her feet. They were wrapped in something thick. She could feel them, which she registered as a good sign. "Where?" she started. "Cabin. Up on the ridge. You were about a quarter-mile off the trail. Lucky the snow showed your track, or I'd have ridden past you." He looked at her then, a brief, assessing look. "You broke some ribs." "I know." "Before tonight." "Yes." He looked back at the fire. "All right," he said. She stared at the ceiling and breathed as carefully as she could around the ribs and listened to the blizzard throw itself against the cabin walls, and thought about the fact that she was here and not dead, which was the most she'd been able to think about anything good for longer than she could remember. "What's your name?" she asked. A pause. "Rowan Creed," he said. She looked at the ceiling. "Alara," she said. "Alara Voss, not Kane." She hadn't called herself Voss in 3 years, but she said it now, and it sat in the air between them, solid and plain and hers. Outside, the blizzard kept going. Inside, the fire burned steady, and for the first time in 3 years, Alara Voss was somewhere that Darius Kane had not planned for her to be. She kept her eyes open as long as she could, and then she slept. She slept for most of the first day. Not the deep healing sleep of someone who had found safety, but the ragged, fitful sleep of a body that had been pushed past its limits and was now conducting emergency repairs with whatever materials were on hand. She surfaced twice, once to hear wind, once to hear the crack and shift of the fire, and both times sank back down before she'd fully registered where she was. The third time she came up, she stayed. The cabin was small and built with the specific practicality of a man who lived alone in hard country and had no interest in impressing anyone. One room, mostly. a sleeping area partitioned by a rough-cut shelf unit stacked with supplies, dried meat, canned goods, lamp oil, rope, things that had weight and purpose. A table with 2 chairs, one of which was occupied. A wood stove and a fireplace, both working, which explained why the cabin was warm in a way that felt almost aggressive after the night she'd had. Furs and hides on the walls, not decoratively but functionally, layered against the cold. A workbench with tools she couldn't fully identify from where she lay. Rowan Creed was at the table. He was doing something with a length of leather strap and a small knife, paring a piece of tack, she thought, though she couldn't see clearly. He worked with the unhurried focus of someone who had spent a lot of time alone and had made peace with silence. She watched him for a moment before she said anything, because she had learned, in 3 years, to read rooms before she announced herself in them. I wasn't like Darius. She knew that already, had known it from the general store, but she cataloged it now with the slower, more careful attention she hadn't been capable of in the snow. His movements were economical. He didn't take up space the way Darius did, that aggressive territorial expansion of a man who measured his authority by how much room he could force other people to vacate. Rowan Creed simply occupied the space he was actually in, no more. "You're awake," he said, without looking up. "How did you know?" Breathing changed. He set down the leather and the knife and turned in his chair to look at her. In the firelight, his face was less severe than she remembered from the store, still sharp-boned, still weathered, but there was something in it that was simply tired in the way of someone who works hard and sleeps honestly, not the brittle, exhausted tension of a man keeping something suppressed. "Feet?" She flexed them experimentally. They hurt, which she understood was good. "They hurt," she said. "Good. That's good." He stood and went to a shelf and came back with a tin cup. "Broth. Drink it slow." She tried to sit up, and the ribs reminded her they existed with a sharpness that took her breath away. He didn't move to help her, which she appreciated, just waited while she worked it out, got herself upright against the wall with small, careful movements, and accepted the cup. "How many ribs?" she asked. "Can't say for certain. 2, maybe 3. Nothing shifting when you breathe, so nothing's moved that shouldn't. You'll know if that changes." He sat back down in the chair beside her, at a distance that was not crowding. "You need to be still for a few days." "I can't be still for a few days." "No?" "He'll come looking." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "Kane." "Yes." "He knows where you went?" "He knows I left. He'll figure out the direction." She drank the broth. It tasted like venison and salt, and she felt her body receive it with a gratitude that was almost embarrassing. "He has men. He has the sheriff. He'll offer money to anyone who brings information." She paused. "He always does." Rowan leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. He was quiet long enough that she started to catalog the silence, the way she cataloged everything, trying to read what was in it. "You took his gun," he said. She glanced down. The revolver was on the low shelf beside the cot, placed there carefully, cylinder open and empty. He'd unloaded it. "It was in the kitchen drawer," she said. "He kept it there." "You know how to use it?" "Yes." He nodded once, slowly. He didn't ask her anything else for a while. She finished the broth and he took the cup and refilled it without being asked and brought it back. And she drank the second one more slowly and watched the fire and thought about March and the Idaho border and a man in Billings that Darius had spoken to. "How was going to sell me," she said. She hadn't planned to say it out loud. It came out the way things sometimes do, from pressure rather than decision. "To a mining camp, across the border." Rowan didn't react visibly. His face stayed exactly as it was, which was something she noted because most people when told a thing like that did something with their face, discomfort, disbelief. That particular wincing sympathy that always made her feel like she was performing her own suffering for someone else's consumption. He just looked at her steadily and waited. "He called it an arrangement," she said. "A clean arrangement. He made it sound like accounting." "When?" "March," he said. "But—" She stopped. "But he came back from Billings early, which means he either moved it up or he was lying about the timeline from the start." "So you ran?" "I ran." She looked at her hands wrapped around the cup. The knuckles were chapped raw from the cold. "I had $11. "Where is it?" "Coat lining, the gun pocket." He got up, found her coat, hanging near the door, still damp, and brought it to her. She found the money where she'd put it, the folded bills and the coins wrapped in a scrap of cloth, and held it in her palm. It looked very small. $11.60, she said. 3 years of taking $2 here, a dollar there. He noticed the $2 I took last week. $2. And he noticed. Rowan sat back down. He looked at the money in her hand for a moment and then looked away. There's a town, he said. Harwick, about 60 miles northwest through the pass. Not a big town, but it's not in Keynes County. Different sheriff. You could... He stopped. I could what? She said. Get a job? Doing what? He owns half the cattle operations in this territory and knows the other half personally. The moment I turn up somewhere looking for work, he'll hear about it inside a week. He has money, and he has reach, and he has... She stopped herself this time. Not because the thought wasn't true, but because she could hear herself spiraling, and spiraling wasn't useful. I'm sorry. Don't be. I don't have a plan, she said flatly. I want to be honest with you. I ran because I had to run, not because I knew where I was going. I don't have family. I don't have money that means anything. I have a cracked rib and a revolver you unloaded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I unloaded it so it didn't fall in fire. I noticed that, she said. Thank you. Rounds are in your coat pocket, left side. She almost laughed. Not quite. It was the shape of a laugh without the sound of one, something that moved through her chest and bumped against the ribs and stopped. She set the money on the blanket beside her and leaned her head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling, which was, like everything else in this cabin, plain and functional and real. Outside, the blizzard had quieted to something steadier. She could still hear the wind, but it had lost the frantic quality of last night, become simply persistent, the way Montana winter was always ultimately just persistent. Why do you live up here? She asked. It wasn't an important question. She asked it because she was tired of her own thoughts, and because something about him made her think the answer might be interesting. I thought about it. She had the sense he wasn't a man who answered questions he hadn't thought about first. Quiet, he said. No politics up here. No one who owes someone else something. Animals are honest about what they want from you. That's either very simple or very complicated, she said. Both, probably. She slept again after that, shorter this time, and when she woke it was dark outside and he'd made food, beans and dried meat cooked together, plain and hot. And he put a plate on the shelf beside her without comment and went back to whatever he'd been doing at the workbench. She ate and watched the fire and tried to think clearly about what was real. What was real? Darius would know she was gone by now. He would not think she was dead. He would think she ran because she had run, and Darius Kane's reaction to being defied was always the same. He didn't let it stand. It wasn't personal in the way that hurt feelings were personal. It was personal in the way that authority was personal, the way any challenge to a man who had built his identity on being unchallenged was personal. He would come looking not because he wanted her back, but because letting her go would mean something about him that he couldn't live with. And when he came looking, the town would talk. The town always talked. A woman missing, a blizzard, a mountain trapper who'd been in the store the day before. People would put those pieces together because people in small frontier towns had very little else to do, and the conclusion would travel from the general store to the saloon to the sheriff's office inside a day. She looked at Rowan's back where he sat at the workbench. He'll come here, she said. Rowan didn't stop what he was doing. Probably. I'm not asking you to fight him. I need you to understand that. I'll be gone before... You can't ride with broken ribs, not in this weather. I'll manage. You said that before. He turned around on the stool to look at her. In the store, when Harlan offered to help with the flour, you said you'd manage. A pause that wasn't unfriendly. How's that working for you? She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that was not quite a challenge, but was not quite not one either. Point taken, she said. He turned back to the workbench. She listened to the wind and the fire and the small, precise sounds of whatever he was repairing. And she thought about Darius, who had never once in 3 years sat in the same room as her without filling it, without making the temperature of it something she had to account for in every breath. She thought about how strange it was to be in a small one-room cabin with a large man and feel the room stay its own size. The night passed. She woke once to find him asleep in the chair by the fire with a blanket across his shoulders, upright, in the posture of someone who slept lightly by habit and not by choice. She looked at him for a moment and looked at the door and looked at her coat and thought about $11.60 and 60 miles of mountain pass in winter with broken ribs on a horse she didn't own. She lay back down. In the morning, she told him about Darius's plan for Idaho. All of it. Not the abbreviated version she'd offered the night before, but the full thing. The study, the desk, the flat administrative voice, the word arrangement, the look on Darius's face that had told her this was already done in his mind, that she was already property transferred, that the conversation was informational rather than negotiable. She told it without ornamentation because ornamentation wasn't something she had the energy for, and she watched Rowan's face while she talked. His face didn't do much, but his hands, which had been resting on the table in front of him, went still in a particular way. Not tense, not clenched, just still, the way something goes still when it's decided something. You said he came back from Billings early, Rowan said when she finished. 2 days early. What did he do when he got back before he called you to the study? She thought about it. Talked to Vivian privately, then supper, then the study. He told Vivian first, yes. Or he confirmed something with Vivian, something she already knew. He turned his cup in his hands. The aunt, she's in it. Vivian has always been in everything, Alara said. She runs the house. She runs Darius sometimes in the ways he doesn't notice he's being run. Alara paused, searching for the right word, and settled on, she's the architecture of it. Darius is the hammer. Vivian is the building the hammer lives in. Rowan absorbed this. Does she know about Idaho? If Darius planned it, she knew before I did. Maybe helped plan it. The fire popped. Outside, the blizzard had faded to an ordinary snowfall, the sky gone from white chaos to a steady, quiet gray. Through the single small window above the workbench, Ilara could see the tree line, dark shapes against the white, and the beginning of the ridge above it, where the mountain climbed toward its own serious cold. 3 years, Rowan said. It wasn't a question. 3 years. And nobody in that town does anything that Darius doesn't sign off on, she said. The sheriff has a Cain brand on him as sure as the cattle do. The judge owes Darius money. The merchants need his patronage. The ranchers need his cooperation on water rights. It's not that they don't know. They know. Every woman who powdered over a bruise in Red Hollow has had her neighbor look at her and look away, because looking away is cheaper than the alternative. What about the people who aren't his? She looked at him. There aren't many. A silence. The old man, Rowan said, bets. In the store. Harlan has a granddaughter in town. Darius would ruin her prospects inside a week if Harlan crossed him. Harlan knows that. He stays quiet, and he hates himself for it. She paused. You could see it, every time. He'd watch something happen, and you'd see it in his face, this grief, like watching a man drown from the bank because you can't swim. Rowan was looking at her steadily. Why are you telling me all this? She asked. Not defensively, genuinely. She was aware she'd told him more in 2 days than she'd told anyone in 3 years, and she was trying to examine the mechanics of that, because she'd learned to be careful about what she gave people to hold. He considered the question with the same slow honesty he seemed to bring to everything. Because you asked, he said. I didn't ask. I just talked. Same thing sometimes. You needed someone to hear it without deciding what it meant before you finished. He leaned back in his chair. Nobody's heard it. 3 years, and nobody heard the whole thing. She looked at the table. No, she said. Nobody heard it. She didn't say anything else for a while, and neither did he, and the snow kept falling outside with the quiet indifference of weather that has no stake in human decisions. And somewhere down the mountain, she knew, a man with river water eyes was calculating routes and distances and the cost of being defied. She thought about the revolver on the shelf, the rounds in her coat pocket. She thought about March, about an Idaho border, about a man in Billings who ran establishments and was always looking. She thought about what it would mean to go back. Then she stopped thinking about that, because there was nothing useful in that direction. And she looked at the window and the tree line and the ridge above, and she thought instead about what the mountain looked like in summer, which she had never seen, which nobody had promised her she would see. But she intended to. The third day in the cabin, Alara got out of the cot on her own. It wasn't graceful. She rolled to the edge first, got her feet on the floor, sat there for a minute breathing through the ribs, which had opinions about vertical, and then stood with one hand on the wall and waited for the dizziness to decide whether it was serious or not. It wasn't. It passed in about 10 seconds, and she straightened up, and that was that. Rowan was outside splitting wood. She could hear the axe, regular, unhurried, the rhythm of someone doing a thing they've done 10,000 times. She used the time alone to take inventory of herself, the way she'd learned to do, that systematic internal accounting that had become second nature. Ribs, bad but stable. Feet, tender but functional. Hands, healing. The bruise along her jaw had faded to the point where it was more memory than mark. She found her boots near the fire, dried and warm, and put them on. Found a coat on a peg near the door. Not hers, one of his, enormous on her, but she put it on anyway, and opened the door and stepped outside. The cold was sharp but honest. No wind. The blizzard had burned itself out sometime in the night, leaving behind the particular stillness of a mountain morning after heavy snow, where the world had been rearranged into something white and exact, and the only sounds were the axe and the movement of the trees and a bird she couldn't identify calling from somewhere down the ridge. Rowan was at the woodpile 20 feet from the door. He looked up when she came out, assessed her standing position for one brief second, and looked back at the log he was splitting. Probably shouldn't be standing in the cold, he said. Probably, she agreed. She stood there anyway, looking at the mountain above them. Up this high, the trees thinned and the rock showed through, gray and permanent, dusted with snow along the ledges. The ridgeline cut the sky at a hard angle. It was, despite everything, beautiful. She hadn't thought the word beautiful about anything in a long time, and it felt slightly foreign in her mouth, like a word in a language she'd once been fluent in. "How far up does it go?" she asked. "The ridge?" "Another 1,800 feet, roughly. There's a pass up top, comes out on the other side above the Clearwater drainage." He split another log, set the halves aside. "In summer you can see 4 mountain ranges from up there." "Have you?" "Most mornings, if the weather holds." She looked at the ridge for another moment. Then she went back inside because the cold was making her ribs tighten, and she wasn't ready to be stubborn about that particular thing yet. On the 4th day, she started moving around the cabin properly, and on the 5th, she helped with the cooking, which Rowan accepted without comment or fuss. He was like that. He didn't make an event of things that weren't events. She'd handed him the salt, and he'd used the salt, and that had been the entire transaction. And there was something in that lack of ceremony that she found, unexpectedly, almost disorienting. She kept waiting for the subtext, the demand hiding inside the ordinary exchange. After 3 years with Darius and Vivian, every act of domestic normalcy had carried a charge, a test, a way it could be done wrong. She kept tensing for an evaluation that never came. On the evening of the 5th day, she said, "You don't have to do that." Rowan looked up from the pot. "Do what?" "Be careful with me." He considered this. "I'm not being careful. I'm being normal." "I forgot what that looks like." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I know." It was 2 words, and it wasn't sympathetic in the soft, pitying way she'd learned to distrust. It was just a plain acknowledgement, and she felt it land differently than pity would have. Less like something breaking open and more like something being located. Like a compass finding north. "Yes, this is where you are. Go from here." That night, lying on the cot and listening to the fire settle, she told him more. Not because she'd planned to. She'd been conservative about what she gave out, had kept the worst parts of it for herself, the way you keep things that are too ugly to show people, but because the dark and the quiet and the 5 days of ordinary had worn down something in her, and the worst parts came out anyway. She told him about the first year, the pattern of it, how it had been established, the way criticism and isolation had come before violence, so that by the time the violence arrived, she'd already been so thoroughly separated from any external reference point that she'd had no one to tell and no language to tell it, and that hadn't already been pre-contaminated by Vivian's careful framing. She told him about a night in the 2nd year when she'd made it as far as the road before Darius had caught her, which had been the end of the spare horse being kept in the near stable. She told him about the money. All of it. Not just the $11, but the whole 3-year architecture of hiding and saving and calculating and waiting, the profound and exhausting patience of someone who has only one play and has to wait for the right moment to make it, and lives in constant fear that the moment will never come, or that they'll misread it when it does. Rowan listened. He was in the chair, as he usually was at night, and he was facing the fire, and she was looking at the ceiling, and it felt less like confession and more like debriefing, like she was giving a report on a territory she'd survived. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Vivian knew about Idaho, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd said it before, but he said it again like he was confirming something in his own thinking. Yes. She helped plan it. Almost certainly. Then she's as much in it as he is. A pause. More, maybe. He makes the decisions. She makes them possible. Elara looked at the ceiling. She told me once that Darius's temper came from caring, from love. She could still hear Vivian's voice saying it, that particular tone of reasonable concern that was really a very refined form of cruelty. She said it with a straight face, over coffee, like she was telling me something useful. Rowan made a sound she couldn't entirely classify. It was short and low, and not quite a laugh. She believe it? He asked. I think she believes everything she says. That's what makes her dangerous. Darius knows what he is, on some level. He just doesn't care. But Vivian has built a whole story around herself where she's the reasonable one, the practical one, and everything she does makes sense inside that story. Elara paused. It's harder to argue with someone who believes their own story. Harder to predict, too, Rowan said. Yes. The fire settled again. A log shifted. The cold pressed against the cabin walls, and the cabin held. Why'd you step in? She asked. In the store. Already told you. You said I know when I said I'd forgotten what normal looked like. You already knew something about him, about what was happening, so you'd seen it before, or you'd been told, or... Harlan, he said. She turned her head. He was still looking at the fire. Bets. He told me about you. Not everything. Harlan's not a gossip. He said things sometimes. When I came in for supplies, mentioned that Kane's wife had come in with a busted lip, or that she'd seemed frightened. Said it the way people say things when they want someone else to do something about it because they can't. A beat. I'd been coming into that store twice a season for 4 years, and he mentioned you 11 times. I counted. Elara stared at the ceiling. He counted, she said, to no one in particular. I did. Why? Because I was paying attention. He turned to look at her then, brief and direct. Someone should have been. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything appropriate to say to that, and she was tired of saying things that were merely appropriate. On the morning of the 6th day, she was standing at the window when she saw the riders. She saw them because she was looking, which was a habit so ingrained she did it automatically. Checked the approaches, the road, the tree line, the ridge. 3 years of that. She saw them below, moving through the trees on the lower slope, still a good distance away but moving upward, with the deliberate progress of men who knew roughly where they were going. She counted. 4 horses. Maybe 5. Hard to tell at this distance. The tree cover broke the line of them. Rowan, she said. I was at the workbench. He came to the window, stood behind her, looked where she was looking. How long? She asked. 20 minutes. Maybe 30. The snow's deep on that slope. He stepped back from the window. You recognize any of them? Too far. But you think, it's him, she said. Not because she could see clearly, but because she knew, the way you know weather before it arrives, in the body before the mind. He came fast. He hired trackers, Rowan said. He was moving now, pulling on his coat, his movement still economical, but with a different quality, focused, certain, the shift from ordinary to operational that she'd seen once before in the general store. He took down a rifle from the wall rack, checked it with quick, practiced hands. Your horse left a track before the second fall of snow covered it. Someone who knows this mountain could follow it. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her. Don't apologize for that. I brought them here. You didn't bring anyone anywhere. He's following you because he chose to follow you. That's on him, not you. He said it plainly, without the particular kind of emphasis that would have made it a lecture, and she heard it and filed it away in the part of herself that kept track of things she intended to believe someday when she had more resources available for belief. Get the revolver. Load it. She went to the shelf. Loaded the Colt with 5 rounds from her coat pocket, checked the cylinder, closed it. Her hands were steadier than she expected. What's the plan? She asked. I was at the window again, watching the slope. I know this mountain. They don't. He turned from the window. There's a pass above the cabin, half-mile up, called Devil's Pass locally. It's a gorge, narrow, maybe 15 feet wide at the pinch point, rock faces on both sides. Anyone coming through there comes through single file and can't see what's ahead. You want to lead them up there? I want to give them the choice of coming up or not. If they come up, he paused. I've worked this mountain for 6 years. I know every slope, every drop, every widowmaker tree that's been waiting to come down for the last decade. Up in that gorge, none of that money or those hired guns means much. It's just terrain, and who knows it better? Alara looked at him. And if they don't come up, she said, if they just wait us out, they won't. Kane's not a patient man when he's angry. You know that better than I do. She did know that. Darius at his most dangerous was always Darius in motion, Darius acting, Darius implementing the decision already made. Waiting was not a thing he did well or willingly. What do you need me to do? She asked. Stay in the cabin until I come back for you. Bar the door. If anyone gets to the door who isn't me, he looked at the Colt in her hand. You know what to do. I've always known what to do, she said. I just needed the chance to do it. Something shifted in his face. Not softness exactly. His face didn't really do softness, but an acknowledgement of something, a recognition. He held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly informational. Then he picked up the rifle and went to the door and opened it, and the cold came in again, and he was gone. She barred the door. She stood at the window with the Colt and watched the slope. The riders came up through the trees, and she counted them properly now. 5. Darius on his black horse, she could see that even at distance, the particular way he sat a horse, upright and proprietary. 2 hired guns flanking him, men she recognized from the Kane property, big, capable, the kind Darius paid well enough to ensure loyalty that didn't ask questions. Sheriff Burl Crane, his star barely visible even on a clear day, his posture the defeated slouch of a man who knew he was doing wrong and had calculated that it paid better than right. And Vivian, in a dark coat on a gray horse, sitting up straight as a fence post, her white hair visible even at distance under a proper hat. She had come herself. Alara registered this with a cold, specific anger that was different from the fear-adjacent anger she'd spent 3 years managing. This was something cleaner, more useful. She watched them reach the flat ground below the cabin and stop. She could see the moment Darius registered the cabin. The slight forward shift in his posture, the head coming up. He said something to the man beside him. The man pointed up the slope, above the cabin, toward the ridge, toward where Rowan had gone. She pressed herself flat to the cabin wall beside the window, watching from the edge of the frame. Darius stood in his stirrups, and she could see his mouth moving, calling up the slope, she realized. Calling Rowan's name, probably, or some version of it, some demand. Darius always led with demands. Nothing came back from the slope. Darius turned to the sheriff, said something. The sheriff shook his head slowly. Vivian moved her horse forward and said something to Darius that involved a gesture toward the cabin, pointing directly at it, and Alara pulled back slightly from the window. Then Darius made the decision she'd known he would make. He pointed up the slope, above the cabin, toward Devil's Pass, and all 5 of them started moving. She watched them go, filing past the side of the cabin below her sight line, moving upward through the deep snow, Darius's black horse breaking trail, the others following in the track he made. She watched until they were into the tree line above, and the mountain had swallowed them, and then she stood in the quiet cabin with the Colt in her hand and listened. For a long time there was only wind. Then, from somewhere up the slope, from somewhere in the direction of the gorge Rowan had called Devil's Pass, she heard a sound like the mountain itself shifting, a deep crack and a sustained rushing, the unmistakable voice of a large tree or a section of snow shelf finally giving way, followed immediately by a horse screaming, then shouting. Then farther away, more shouting, and another sound she couldn't classify, and then a single shot, and then silence. She stood at the window. Her heart was doing something irregular. The Colt was in both hands now, without her having consciously raised it. She waited. The silence from above stretched out long enough that she started doing calculations. How long to walk down from the pass? How long if he was hurt? How long if he wasn't? She watched the tree line above the cabin and breathed carefully around her ribs, and told herself to be still. 22 minutes after the shot, she counted, a figure came out of the tree line above the cabin and came down the slope at a steady pace. One figure, long coat, dark fur, moving unhurried through the snow. She unbarred the door. Rowan came in and stomped the snow from his boots and set the rifle back on the wall rack and said nothing for a moment, his back to her, and she watched him and waited. Vivian went into the east ravine, he said. Her horse shied at the tree coming down and went sideways. He turned around. There was snow on his coat and a cut along his jaw that was bleeding slowly. She could see the dark line of it against his weathered skin. She's alive. The drop wasn't that far, but she's not riding anywhere today. The sheriff took a round through the shoulder. He said it without ceremony. He'll live. His men pulled him back down the mountain when the shooting started. I gave them enough to convince them that continuing up wasn't in their professional interest. And Darius? Rowan looked at her steadily. Darius is alone, he said. Up in the pass. On foot. I took his horse. A silence. On foot, she said. In the pass. He can get down, but it'll take him time, and he'll be cold, and there won't be anyone waiting for him with a gun this time. He paused. I could have ended it differently. Up there. She looked at him. I know, he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. But that's your call to make, not mine. She stood with the Colt in her hand and looked at the window and thought about Darius Kane alone on a mountain he didn't know. In the cold he'd always used as a backdrop for other people's suffering, with none of his money and none of his men and none of his architecture of power to hold him up. She thought about the look on his face when Rowan's hand had closed around his wrist in the general store. That small, involuntary sound. She thought about Idaho, about the man in Billings, about a clean arrangement. She set the Colt on the table. Bring him down, she said. Rowan looked at her. I want to look at him, she said. I want him to look at me. She met Rowan's eyes. And then I want to decide. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he put his coat back on and picked up the rifle and went back out into the cold. She sat at the table and waited, and outside the mountain held its silence like something that had been watching all along and was finally, after a very long time, about to see how the story ended. End of part 3. Rowan was gone 40 minutes. Alara sat at the table and did not pace, because pacing was something she'd trained herself out of in the Kane household, where visible anxiety was information she couldn't afford to give. Instead, she sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the grain of the wood and breathed through the ribs and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she'd developed the same way you develop any skill nobody wants to have, through extensive involuntary practice. The Colt was on the table 3 inches from her right hand. She'd thought about loading it with all 5 rounds, and then thought about it differently and left it where it was. The fire needed a log. She got up and put one in and sat back down. At the 30-minute mark, she heard something on the slope. Movement in the snow, the sound of more than one person. She went to the window. 2 figures coming down through the tree line, Rowan in front, moving at his usual unhurried pace. Behind him, stumbling slightly in the deep snow, his hands bound in front of him with what looked like a length of leather cord, was Darius Kane. He looked different. She watched him come down the slope and tried to locate the specific quality of the difference. He was still large, still physically imposing, still wearing his good coat. But the coat was wet and disordered, and he was moving with the exaggerated, careful steps of someone whose feet had gone cold. And without the horse, and the hired men, and the sheriff, and the whole mobile architecture of his authority around him, he was simply a man in his 40s who had gotten cold and lost on a mountain he didn't know. And the reduction of him to that was startling in a way she hadn't entirely anticipated. She'd imagined this. Versions of this. In the small, quiet part of herself she kept protected. She'd imagined Darius small and cornered and afraid many times in the past 3 years, and in every version of it she'd felt something she'd understood as satisfying. What she actually felt, watching him come down the slope with his hands tied and his expensive boots soaked through, was more complicated and less satisfying and more real. She went back to the table. She sat. She put her hand on the Colt and then took it off and left it where it was. Rowan opened the door and came in and moved to the side, and Darius Kane came through the door of the cabin and the room changed, the way it always changed when he entered a space, and Alara felt the old reflexive bracing happen in her body before her mind had a chance to override it. 3 years of that. It wasn't going to undo in a day. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her. She looked back. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before. Or rather, she'd seen the components of it separately, but never assembled in quite this configuration. There was anger, which was familiar, but it was tamped down under something else. Something that was either cold calculation or the beginning of fear, and she couldn't tell yet which one it was, and she understood that the difference mattered. Sit down, she said. He didn't move. Rowan, she said, without looking away from Darius. Rowan put one hand on Darius's shoulder and applied what appeared to be a modest amount of pressure,
and Darius sat. He sat in the chair across the table from her, his bound hands in his lap, and looked at her with those river water eyes and said nothing. The silence stretched. "You talked to a man in Billings," Elara said. Nothing from Darius. "His name?" she said. "Give me his name." A muscle moved in Darius's jaw. "You're making a mistake," he said. His voice was controlled. She'd give him that. It was still mostly the public voice, steady and measured. "Whatever you think is happening here—" "His name," she said again. "This doesn't change anything. You understand that? You're still my wife, legally. You're still—" "His name." Darius looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Rowan, who was standing against the wall to Alara's right with his arms crossed and an expression of complete neutrality. Darius's eyes moved over Rowan the way they'd moved over him in the general store, that calculating inventory, looking for the angle, the leverage, the thing that could be used. She watched him not find it. "Halford," Darius said. "Edgar Halford. He runs a—" "I know what he runs," she said. "I know where it is. I know what you arranged with him, and when you arranged it, and what he paid you for the arrangement." She didn't know all of that. She knew the shape of it, not every detail. But she said it the way she'd learned to say things she needed him to believe, flatly and without inflection, and she watched it land. "What I want to know is whether Vivian helped plan it, or whether you planned it alone." Something shifted in his face. "She has nothing to do with— Darius!" She said his name with a precision she hadn't used with him in years, not the careful managing tone she'd used in the house. Something older than that, something from before. "We're up here alone on a mountain and your hired men are gone and your sheriff is bleeding in the snow somewhere below us. This is not a negotiation. This is you telling me the truth, possibly for the first and last time in our acquaintance. So, Vivian." Another silence. "She knew," he said finally. "She planned it." He looked at the table. "She made the introduction to Halford." A pause that had something almost like shame in it, or what shame looks like on a man who doesn't have much practice with it. "She's known Halford since before I did. They have a business history." Elara absorbed this. It wasn't a surprise, but hearing it said plainly was different from having suspected it. Vivian, with her coffee cup and her fence-line disputes and her voice of reasonable concern, had known a man like Edgar Halford, had introduced her nephew to him for the purpose of disposing of a woman who had become inconvenient. She held that information and let it settle. "Where is Vivian now?" she asked Rowan. "East Ravine, like I said. She's not hurt badly, cold and shaken up." He paused. "She'll be able to ride by tomorrow if someone brings her horse down to her." Elara looked at Darius. "Your aunt is in a ravine." "I know that." "You're concerned." He looked up. The calculation in his eyes had shifted again, looking for something, some opening, some version of this situation where he came out ahead. She could see him working through it, and she could see him not finding what he was looking for. And it was that, the specific sight of Darius Kane not finding what he was looking for, that made something release in her chest, something that had been locked down for 3 years. Some valve she hadn't known was still capable of opening. "Listen to me," Darius said, and his voice shifted, went lower and more careful, and she recognized what he was doing before he did it, but she let him do it anyway because she wanted to hear it. "This has gone far enough. You're hurt. You've been hurt, and I understand that. And I take responsibility for—" He stopped, reorganized. This was the voice she thought of as the almost voice, the voice from the beginning, the one that almost sounded like contrition, the one that had kept her off balance in the first year, because she'd kept thinking that this version of him, the almost remorseful version, was the real one, and the other version was the aberration. "Come home. That's all. Come home and we can talk about what happened and what I said about Idaho. I made that decision badly. I can admit that, and we can—" "Edgar Halford," she said. He stopped. "Do you think," she said slowly, "that I sat in this cabin for 6 days and didn't think about every version of what you would say to me when you got here? Do you think I don't know every note of that voice? I have been listening to that voice for 3 years, Darius. I know when it comes, and I know what it comes before." She looked at him. It always came before something worse. His face closed. The almost remorseful version folded up and put itself away, and what was left was the version she knew better, the stripped-down one, the one that didn't bother with performance because it had decided performance wasn't necessary. "You can't run far enough," he said. "You know that. I have resources and contacts in every territory between here and—"
I know what you have, she said. I lived inside it for 3 years. Then you know this ends one way. I know how you think it ends, she said. That's different. He looked at her hands, at the Colt on the table. Are you going to shoot me? He said. There was something in the way he said it that was almost curious, almost clinical, the voice of a man who genuinely wasn't sure and was trying to calculate the probability. Is that what this is? She didn't answer immediately. She thought about this kitchen floor, the 12 steps going up the stairs, the $2 he'd noticed out of 40, 3 years of $2, and $1.50, the whole long, careful, exhausting patience of it. She thought about March in Idaho and Edgar Halford's establishments across the border. She thought about the word arrangement in his flat, accounting voice. She put her hand on the Colt, picked it up. Darius went very still. She cocked the hammer back, and the sound of it in the small cabin was enormously loud, and she watched his face go through something she had needed to see for 3 years. Not the performance of fear, not the calculated simulation of vulnerability. He sometimes deployed for effect, but actual fear, the involuntary physical fear of a man who has just understood that the situation is real and that the person across the table from him is not afraid. She held it there for 5 seconds, 10. She thought about pulling the trigger. She thought about what it would mean. Not legally, not practically, not in the abstract sense of consequences, but what it would mean in the place where she actually lived, the interior place she'd been protecting and defending and keeping alive through 3 years of everything he'd done to try and extinguish it. Whether killing him would feed that place or hollow it out further, whether she would be free or whether she would carry the specific weight of it everywhere, different from what she carried now, but heavy in its own way. She looked at him and she didn't know the answer, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that. She lowered the hammer. She put the Colt back on the table. Darius exhaled, a slow, involuntary deflation, and she watched it happen and felt nothing except a clean, clear certainty about what she was going to do instead. Take off your boots, she said. He stared at her. Your boots, she said. Take them off. Elara. And the coat. He looked at the window, at the snow. It's below freezing. You are going to walk back down this mountain, she said. The same way every person you ever put out in the cold walked. And you are going to do it in your socks and your jacket. And when you reach Red Hollow, you're going to walk into that town the way I walked into it for 3 years. And you are going to understand for the first time in your life what it feels like when the cold is not a thing you're watching from a window. She held his eyes. Take off the boots. Something happened in his face that she hadn't seen before and didn't have a name for. It wasn't quite shame, and it wasn't quite rage, and it was something in between, some emotion that had no proper word, because men like Darius Kane didn't have enough practice with it to have developed the vocabulary. He took off the boots. He took off the coat. He sat across from her in his socks and his shirt and his vest, and he looked at her with those river water eyes, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Rowan moved off the wall and took Darius by the arm and walked him to the door and opened it, and the cold came in, and Darius Kane stepped out into the snow in his socked feet and turned around once to look at her, standing in the doorway of a cabin that wasn't his, on a mountain he'd come to take something from, empty-handed. This isn't over, he said. Walk, Rowan said. Darius walked. They watched him from the door until the tree line took him, moving fast, faster than he'd moved coming down, because the cold was immediate and serious and he knew it. His tracks in the snow were dark and sharp-edged against the white. He didn't look back after the first time. Rowan closed the door. The cabin was quiet. Elara stood with her hand on the back of the chair and felt the shaking start in her legs, which she'd been suppressing for the last 20 minutes. And she let it come now. Let her body have its say about what the last hour had cost her. It wasn't collapse. It wasn't grief. It was just the physical accounting that happens after sustained adrenaline. The body sending in its invoice. She sat down in the chair and put her elbows on the table and her face in her hands and breathed. Rowan sat in the other chair. He didn't say anything. He didn't put a hand on her shoulder or offer anything verbal in the way of comfort, which was exactly right, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him in 6 days that she hadn't understood about most people in a lifetime, that he knew the difference between presence and interference. After a while, the shaking stopped. She lifted her head from her hands. Vivian, she said. Tomorrow, Rowan said. Her horse is still up on the slope. I'll bring it down in the morning, get her moving. She'll find her way to town. She'll go to the sheriff. The sheriff has a bullet in his shoulder, and a story he's going to have trouble telling without implicating himself. He leaned back in the chair. Vivian's a problem, but she's a problem that needs time and resources to build back into something. Right now, she's an old woman in a ravine who can't prove anything. Alara thought about Vivian in the ravine, the white hair and the straight posture and the reasonable voice. She thought about the cup of coffee and the fence line dispute, and all the small daily acts of cruelty dressed as care that she'd absorbed for 3 years like a slow and specific poison. She'll rebuild, Alara said. You know that. She'll go back to Red Hollow, and she'll start constructing a version of what happened, and she'll find a way to make it look like... Probably, Rowan said. But you won't be in Red Hollow when she does. She looked at him. Harwick, she said. It was the town he'd mentioned that first night. 60 miles northwest through the pass. Different sheriff. Not Keynes County. Or further, Rowan said. Oregon, maybe. The passes will be open in a month if the weather shifts. I have $11, she said. It was slightly absurd to say it, in the context of the morning she'd just had, and she felt the absurdity of it, and it almost made her laugh again, that almost laugh that had become its own category of response. I know, he said. 1160. She looked at the table. At the Colt. At the scratched and worn surface of the wood between them. 6 years of someone living alone and doing the work that living alone requires. Rowan, she said. Yeah, what you did up in that pass. The tree, the shots, all of it. She paused. You did that for a woman you've known 6 days. He was quiet for a moment. Harlan mentioned you 11 times, he said. I knew you longer than 6 days. She held that. Outside, somewhere far below on the mountain, a man in his socks was walking 20 miles through the snow, and it was not enough for what he'd done, and she knew that, and it was also not nothing, and she knew that too. The mountain didn't care about the distinction. The cold didn't negotiate. He would reach Red Hollow, diminished and cold and without the particular armor of impunity that had protected him for 20 years. And what he did with that was beyond her control. And that was all right. Control had never been what she was after. She reached across the table and picked up the Colt and looked at it for a moment, and then got up and put it in her coat pocket where it had always belonged. I want to see the ridge, she said, when the weather holds. Rowan looked at her. Something in his face had shifted, the same thing she'd seen briefly in the general store and again in small moments over 6 days. Not quite a smile, but what a smile comes from, the thing underneath it. Weather'll hold tomorrow, he said. She looked at the window. The sky above the tree line was clearing for the first time in a week, the gray breaking apart to show something blue behind it, cold and high and very clear. Good, she said. End of part 4. The weather held. Alara woke before dawn on the 7th day and lay still for a moment in the gray pre-light, doing the inventory she'd done every morning for 3 years. Ribs, still bad but better, the sharp edge of the pain softening into something duller and more manageable. Feet, fine. Hands, healed. The bruise along her jaw was gone. She pressed 2 fingers to the place where it had been and felt nothing except her own face, which was hers, which had always been hers, which she was reclaiming the same way she was reclaiming everything else, not all at once, not cleanly, but steadily and with intention. She got up without help. Rowan was already awake, sitting at the table with coffee, looking at nothing in particular the way he did in the mornings. Not blank, just present, occupying the quiet without needing to fill it. He poured a second cup without being asked and slid it across the table. She sat down and drank it, and looked at the window, where the sky was beginning its slow shift from black to the deep blue that preceded actual light up here at altitude. Vivian, she said, brought her horse down at first light yesterday. She was on the road by mid-morning. He turned his cup in his hands. She didn't say anything when I found her. Vivian always says something. She looked at me for a long time. He paused. Then she got on her horse and rode. Alara thought about that. Vivian Crow, in a dark coat on a gray horse, riding down out of the mountains with whatever she was carrying, cold, humiliation, the specific damage of having her machinery dismantled in a way she hadn't planned for. Vivian would reach Red Hollow and she would start building, because building was what Vivian did. It was her primary function, the architecture of justification and narrative control that had sustained the Kane household for years. She would find a version of what had happened that served her, and she would install it in the town the way she installed everything, carefully, incrementally,
with the patience of a woman who had learned that patience was the most effective weapon available to someone without direct power.
She'll say I stole the gun,
Alara said.
that I ran, that you... She'll construct something around you.
Probably.
Does that concern you? Rowan was quiet for a moment.
I've lived on this mountain for 6 years and kept to myself, and nobody down there has had any particular reason to bother me. That changes when Vivian gets done talking. He said it without self-pity, just straightforwardly, the way he said most things.
But I was never planning to stay here forever. Mountains don't belong to anybody. There are other mountains. She looked at him across the table in the early morning light. 6 days of knowing someone and understanding something about them that some people never understood about people they'd known for years. She'd thought about why that was, in the small hours when she couldn't sleep, and the closest she'd come to an answer was that Rowan Creed didn't perform himself. He was exactly what he appeared to be, which was such a rare quality that she hadn't known how to recognize it at first, had kept looking for the seam, the place where the presentation parted from the reality. There wasn't one. It was strange to trust someone. She'd forgotten how it felt and was relearning it with the specific caution of a person who has been burned by the exact mechanism they're now trying to use again. She didn't try to do it faster than she could. She just let it be what it was. I want to go to the ridge first, she said, before we do anything else, before we figure out the direction and the money and all of it. I want to see what you said you could see from up there. He looked at her. You're not ready for an 1,800-foot climb, he said. I know, I don't care. A pause. All right, he said. They left the cabin an hour after sunrise. The snow on the slope above the cabin had been packed hard by wind and the cold of successive nights, which made the footing better than she'd expected. She moved slowly. Rowan moved slowly beside her, not because of his own pace, but calibrating to hers, without making it obvious that he was calibrating. She noticed and didn't mention it. The climb took twice what it should have. Her ribs made every steep section a negotiation, and the altitude at the top of the ridge made her chest work harder than the ribs appreciated. She stopped 3 times. Not to rest, she told herself, but to look back at the valley below, which kept revealing itself in pieces as they climbed. First the tree line below the cabin, then the lower slopes, then the valley floor itself, the town of Red Hollow, a small dark cluster 7 miles south, the road threading through the white. From up here, it looked very small. She stood and looked at it and thought about all the ways that small place had defined the shape of her life for 3 years, had been the entire perimeter of what was possible and what wasn't, and felt the strange vertigo of seeing a cage from the outside after having only ever seen it from within. Come on, Rowan said. The top of the ridge was a rocky flat section about 30 feet wide, swept clean of deep snow by the wind, with a drop on the eastern side and the view Rowan had described on the west, north, and south. He hadn't exaggerated. She stood at the edge of the flat and looked out, and the world opened up in 4 directions with the particular extravagance of high places that have no interest in being modest about themselves. Ranges she didn't know the names of, blue-white in the distance, ridge after ridge diminishing into a haze that was either cloud or the limit of visibility. The clear water drainage below them to the northwest, a dark line of trees following water she couldn't see. And above all of it, a sky of the specific hard blue that only exists at altitude in winter, so clear it almost had a sound. She stood there for a while. She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything adequate to say. Rowan stood a few feet away and looked at the same view he'd said he saw most mornings, and didn't say anything either, and the silence between them was one of the better silences she'd experienced in recent memory, which was not a high bar but was a real one. I used to think, she said eventually, that if I could just get out far enough, everything behind me would stop being real. Like distance was the same as erasure. She watched a shadow move across the far range, a cloud crossing the sun. But it doesn't work like that. No, Rowan said. It comes with you. Some of it. She paused. I'm going to have bad nights for a long time. I know that. I'm going to flinch at things I shouldn't flinch at and trust people wrong and probably make decisions out of fear when I think I'm making them out of reason. She said it plainly, without apology, because she'd had 6 days to look at herself honestly, and she'd decided that honesty about what was damaged was the only way to be serious about repair. I'm not walking away from this fixed. I'm walking away from this alive, which is different. Rowan looked at her with an expression she'd come to recognize, that direct, unhurried attention that didn't require her to soften or clarify or perform confidence she didn't have. That's enough, he said. Alive is enough to start. She looked at the ranges. At the Clearwater drainage below, the dark thread of trees going northwest. Harwick is that way? She asked. About there. He pointed slightly north of the drainage. You can't see it from here. Too low. And beyond Harwick? More of this. Different country. Wetter. More timber, once you're past the divide. Into Oregon eventually, if you follow the watershed down. Have you been that far? Once, years ago. He was quiet for a moment. It's good country. She looked at the northwest, at the country she couldn't see yet. That was nevertheless there, continuous with the ground she was standing on, connected by drainage and ridge and the long logic of the land that didn't care about county lines or cane property surveys or any of the human geometry she'd been trapped inside. Oregon, she said, trying it out. If you want, he said. She looked at him. Are you asking something? He met her eyes. I'm saying Oregon is an option, if you want company that far. A pause. Or not. Either way. It was such a plain, straightforward offer, delivered without pressure or expectation, that she almost didn't know what to do with it. She'd spent 3 years in a house where every offer contained a contract with terms that weren't disclosed until after the signing, and the uncomplicated honesty of what he'd just said sat in the air between them, and she looked at it and believed it. Let me think about it, she said. All right. They stood on the ridge for another 20 minutes, and then they went back down. The descent was harder on the ribs than the climb had been, which she hadn't anticipated but probably should have, and by the time they reached the cabin she was tired in a way that lived deep in the bones. She sat at the table and drank water and let the tiredness be what it was, and didn't apologize for it. While she sat, Rowan laid out what they had in the way of practical resources, the same flat inventory she'd learned to appreciate about him. 2 horses, his and the spare he'd taken from Darius on the mountain, and which was, she noted, significantly finer than his own. Supplies for a 2-week trail. A rifle, her Colt, ammunition. $63 in a tin box on the shelf which he set on the table next to her, $11.60 without comment, as if he were simply adding a column of numbers. A compass. 2 sets of cold weather gear. Knowledge of the route northwest. She looked at the money on the table. Rowan. It's not charity, he said, before she could say what she was about to say. I was leaving this mountain anyway, sooner or later. You just moved the timeline. You said that before, that you weren't planning to stay forever. True when I said it. And now you're choosing to leave because of me. He sat down across from her. He looked at the money, and then at her, and there was something in his face that was neither calculation nor performance, just a person looking at another person, honestly across a table with the fire going and the cold outside and the complicated truth of how they'd arrived at this moment. I'm choosing to leave because there's good country northwest of here and a woman I respect who's going that direction, he said. Those are the reasons. You can do what you want with them. She looked at the table, at $74.60, which was not a fortune but was a direction. I don't know who I am without all of that behind me, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. That's the honest truth. I know who I was before it, and I know what I am now, and I don't know yet who I'm going to be when I've been out from under it long enough to find out. She looked up. That's not a warning. It's just true. I know, he said. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being accurate. She was quiet for a moment, then, I'd like the company. Something in him settled, a small relaxation she wouldn't have caught if she hadn't been paying attention, and she thought about all the things he hadn't said over the past 6 days, the care he'd taken with the distance between them, the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be hurried and had chosen not to hurry them. We leave tomorrow, he said. Weather's holding, and we should move before Vivian has time to build something in town. Tomorrow, she agreed. She slept well that night, which surprised her. Not perfectly. She woke once at some small sound and lay with her heart going fast until she located herself, remembered where she was, felt the specific quality of the cabin's silence, which was not the silence of the cane house, not the silence of a held breath, or suppressed anger or waiting, but just the silence of a place where nothing was about to happen except the continuation of ordinary night. She lay with her eyes open for a few minutes, listening to the fire and the wind and the distant sound of the mountain doing what mountains do, and then she went back to sleep. In the morning, they packed the horses. She was better at the girth buckle this time. Her hands were steady. They rode out of the cabin yard at first light,
heading northwest along the ridge trail, and she turned in the saddle once to look back at the cabin, small against the cliff face, smoke beginning to rise from the chimney in the cold air, the whole small, sturdy structure that had been, for 7 days, the place where she'd stopped being someone's property and started being herself again. She looked at it long enough to remember it properly. Then she turned back to the trail and didn't look again. The first day of riding was hard on the ribs, and she didn't complain about it. They stopped at midday to eat and rest the horses, and she sat on a fallen pine in the sun and ate dried meat and looked at the country they'd come through and thought about Red Hollow 7 miles south and east, and tried to locate what she felt about it. What she felt was not hatred, exactly. Hatred implied that the place still had a claim on her energy, and she was becoming increasingly reluctant to give it that. What she felt was something cooler, a clear-eyed understanding of what the place had been and what it had failed to be, and what she no longer needed from it. She thought about Harlan Betts, who had counted 11 times and had never found a way to do more than count. And she thought, I don't hate you, old man. You were afraid, and afraid people do what afraid people do. I just can't afford to need anything from you anymore. She thought about Darius, who had walked 20 miles in his socks through the snow, who had arrived in Red Hollow, diminished and freezing and stripped of the one thing that had organized his entire life, the absolute certainty that consequence did not apply to him. She didn't know what he would do with that. Maybe nothing. Maybe he would reconstruct the empire, brick by brick, the way men like him always seemed to find the resources to reconstruct what had been taken from them. Maybe Vivian was already laying the foundation, but he would do it without her. That was the thing she kept returning to, the fixed point around which everything else could be uncertain. Whatever Darius Kane did from here, he would do it without her in the room. Without her hands on the table, without her learning the sound of his footsteps through the ceiling, without her powdering anything over. That was enough. It had to be enough. And she was slowly, with the stubbornness that had always been her most reliable quality, learning to believe that it was. They made camp that night in a stand of timber with a good windbreak and a creek that was frozen solid enough to chip water from with a hatchet. Rowan built a small fire and she helped, and it took 3 tries to get the wet wood to catch. And when it finally caught, they both leaned back and looked at it with the particular satisfaction of a thing that was difficult and worked anyway. Tell me about Oregon, she said. He thought about it. He always thought about things before he said them, which she had come to find not a slowness but a respect for the question, for the person asking it, for the value of saying something true rather than something merely responsive. Wetter, he said. More green. The coast has weather that comes in off the water, big storms, nothing like Montana winter, but its own kind of serious. He turned his cup in his hands. The valley country is rich. Good soil, timber, rivers full of fish. More people than up here, but it's still frontier enough that people mostly keep to their own business. Mostly, she said. Mostly. A pause. There are bad people everywhere. I'm not going to tell you there isn't. I know there isn't, she said. I'm not looking for a place without bad people. I'm looking for a place where I can see them coming. She looked at the fire. That's all. Enough room and enough ground under my feet that I can see what's moving toward me and make a real decision about it, instead of living inside something with no walls I could identify. He was quiet. That's the thing about a cage, she said. You think the problem is the cage, but the cage is only the last part of it. The first part is when someone convinces you that the walls are for your own protection, when you start using their language, when you explain your own imprisonment in their terms. She paused, and the fire went through a small collapse and rebuilt itself from the coals. I was doing that. By the second year I was doing that. And some part of me knew it and couldn't stop it because I didn't have anything else to replace it with. No outside reference. No one to tell me that the words I was using were his words and not mine. Rowan was looking at her across the fire. She could see the light move on his face. You figured it out anyway, he said. Barely. Barely still count. She looked at the fire for a long time. The cold was working at the edges of the firelight, pressing in the way cold always did, patient and thorough. And she pulled her coat tighter and felt the weight of the Colt in the inside pocket, and thought about all the months she'd kept that pocket empty, had imagined a gun in it as a theoretical comfort, and about the difference between imagining a thing and having the thing and knowing, finally, that you will use it if you need to. She hadn't needed to. She thought about that. About standing across the table from Darius with the hammer cocked and looking at him, and making the choice not because she was afraid of the consequences, and not because she had forgiven him anything,
She hadn't. She wasn't going to. Forgiveness was its own project, and she wasn't ready to start it. But because she had looked at herself in that moment, and the person she found there was someone who did not need to destroy him in order to be free of him. He didn't get to be the last thing she did. He didn't get to be the noun that defined the verb of her life. She had chosen the distance instead of the damage, and it was not the noble, cinematic choice it might sound like from the outside. It was a practical one. She had enough to carry. She didn't need his death on top of it. That was the truth of it, plain and unbeautiful, and she'd learned in the past week to prefer the plain, unbeautiful truth to any version that required her to be someone she wasn't. 3 weeks later, they rode into Harwick. It was a smaller town than Red Hollow. 2 main streets, a proper hotel, a mercantile, a livery, a land office. The sheriff was a man named Aldous Birch, heavyset and direct, who looked at them when they stopped to ask about rooms with the straightforward assessment of a man doing his job rather than protecting someone else's interests. He told them the hotel had 2 vacancies and gave them directions without being asked for anything in return, and she thought, all right, this is what a different county feels like. They stayed 3 days in Harwick, restocked supplies, rested the horses, let her ribs have a few days of not being on horseback. She helped Rowan with the horses, and she sat in the hotel dining room and ate real food, and she walked the 2 main streets in the cold and let herself be a stranger, which was uncomfortable and also, in a way she hadn't expected, a relief. Nobody knew her name here. Nobody was watching her face for information about what she was or wasn't allowed to feel. She could be any version of herself she chose to present, and the town didn't have a pre-existing opinion about which version was appropriate. On the second evening in Harwick, a woman at the mercantile asked her where she was headed, and she said, Oregon. And the woman said that was good country and asked if she had family there. She said no, and the woman said that was all right. Family wasn't the only way to start, and went back to her business. And Alara stood in the mercantile for a moment after the woman had gone and held that in her chest like something fragile that she didn't want to put down. Family wasn't the only way to start. On the third morning, they rode out of Harwick heading northwest, following the drainage down through country that was getting greener as the altitude dropped, the timber thickening, the snow going patchy and then occasional and then mostly absent on the south-facing slopes. She could feel the air changing, getting softer, less like a substance that was actively trying to harm her. They didn't talk much on the trail, which she had come to understand was not a sign of distance, but of its opposite. People who had something to prove to each other filled the silence compulsively, and they didn't have anything to prove. There was an easy quality to the quiet between them that she was learning to inhabit without suspicion, the way you learn to inhabit any new space, slowly and with attention and without assuming it was going to be taken from you. She thought about her father sometimes, on the long stretches of trail. She thought about the way he used to correct the angle of her wrist when she was learning to shoot, the patient repetition of it, and the way he'd said her name when he was proud of her, which was different from the way he said it any other time. She thought about what he would make of the past 3 years and the past 3 weeks, and she thought he would have been sorry about the first and unsurprised by the second. He'd always said she was the stubbornest thing he'd ever known and had meant it as a compliment. She missed him. That hadn't gone away and she didn't expect it to. But she was carrying it differently now. Not the weight of it pressing down, but the weight of it alongside. A loss you move through the world with, rather than a thing that moves through the world on top of you. There was a difference, and she was learning it. Somewhere on the far side of the mountains that were still visible to the east on clear days, smaller now, more distant, Darius Kane was in Red Hollow, and Vivian Crow was building her version of what had happened, and the sheriff had a bullet wound that needed explaining, and the county would be doing what small counties did, absorbing the disturbance and pressing it back into shape around the space she'd left. She thought about that less and less as the miles accumulated. What she thought about more was the trail ahead, and the country she hadn't seen yet, and the way Rowan had described the Oregon coast, weather that comes in off the water, its own kind of serious. And the question of what she wanted, which was a question she was only now, at 25 years old, in a position to ask without the answer being overwritten by someone else's answer before she could finish the sentence. She didn't know yet. That was honest. She knew some things. She wanted ground under her feet that was hers. She wanted to work at something she chose. She wanted to be spoken to in a tone of voice that assumed she was a full person with full capacity for decision, which was a standard. So basic, she was slightly ashamed it had taken her this long to name it as a requirement. She wanted. When the bad nights came. And they would come. She knew that. She'd stopped pretending otherwise. She wanted to be somewhere she could get up and go outside and stand in the open air and feel the size of the world around her, and remember that it was large, that it contained things she hadn't seen yet, that 3 years inside a cage was a chapter and not the whole book. She pulled her coat tighter against the trail wind and looked northwest at the country opening up ahead of her and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for, something that lived in the vicinity of hope without being quite that fragile. Rowan rode beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. The mountains fell away behind them. The timber closed in, dark and sweet-smelling, and the trail wound down through it toward whatever was on the other side, and she rode toward it without knowing what she'd find, which was frightening, and also, for the first time in a very long time, something that felt less like a threat and more like a life. She kept riding.